So it is my extreme privilege to introduce the leader of our next panel and let him take it to the conversation about finance. In a political career, there's an acronym that is NIM2, which is not in my term of office. And what that means is if you want something done and it's fairly testy, we're not doing it in my term of office. I have to tell you, there are very few statesmen that I know of that disregard that message and really look towards the legacy of the state and the community they serve. Federico Peña is one of those. He began his career in the House of Representatives, which led him to be a two-term mayor for the city of Denver. The vision of Denver International Airport was integral, and his leadership was critical to that. He went on to serve as the Secretary of Transportation with President Clinton, and then I think, not really meaning to, went on to serve as the Secretary of Energy for a year and a half, and continued that and has come back to Colorado, and is looking and sits as a senior policy advisor with the Colorado Impact Fund. And the companies that he looks at, he's looking at whether they're really viable right now, but he knows they will be. And that's been Mr. Peña's vision his whole life. Let's look at the future. My term of office is less important than the legacy we leave in Colorado. So I'd like to introduce to you Federico Peña.
Thank you very much, Cathay. You know, I've been introduced in many different ways, but I have to say that's the most extraordinary introduction I've ever had. So please give her a round of applause. I mean that. I had not yet focused on this notion of people not wanting to do anything when they're in office. It seems like such an obvious thing. Why else be in office but for wanting to do something? But to make that point brings it back home, and I had never quite put that in context. So, Cathay, thank you very much. And by the way, Cathay, congratulations on your leadership here in putting this conference together, and to CSU, and to everybody who has worked so hard to make this the extraordinary success that it already is. I remember we had this conversation 5 months ago in my office in Denver, where you came and shared this vision of having this conference summit. And I was intrigued because I don't think I'd ever heard that kind of focus on agriculture, but here it is. And obviously it's been a great success, and we were joking earlier about whether you're going to do this next year. We'll do a survey after this, and I'm sure most will say yes. So congratulations again, Cathay. Good morning, everybody. I am told that this afternoon will be the official start of spring. Has someone already said that? Oh. Well, spring then starts right now, since I'll move up the schedule. I am very honored and happy to be here. My role this morning is twofold. One is to make some introductory comments, which I hope will put into context the panel that will follow. And by the way, you're going to be introduced to an extraordinary group of individuals who I think will provide very good information to all of you. And by the way, we want to welcome your questions sometime during the panel. But my task is to open up the panel discussion with a general conversation, and that is this. So in my work today with the Colorado Impact Fund, and by the way, we're about a $63 million fund created about 8 months ago in Denver, funded by high net worth individuals here in the state who wanted to invest in Colorado-based companies, who were beyond sort of this early stage, but perhaps not profitable yet. We've already made our first investment of a company in Boulder called Bhakti Chai. Anybody tried it? Please raise your hand. Thank you. Keep drinking it. But that's what we're doing. And so from an investor perspective, and you're going to hear this in the panels, the question is, what does it require for us as investors to have greater confidence and certainty in investing in the agricultural sector here in Colorado? And so I thought about that, and I talked to some people at the State Department of Ag, and I have three suggestions. The first is for either the state or perhaps CSU or some other group to put together a comprehensive strategy around supply and demand management in agriculture. Now, what does that mean? It's very simple. In the old days, when I did some work in the San Luis Valley and I met a lot of the potato farmers, the home of the red McClure, and up here in northern Colorado, and on the western slope, people who are growing peaches, and on eastern plains, winter wheat. It struck a number of us that perhaps there's not enough coordination among all the growers and producers in the types of products they're producing, particularly the variable growing season we have in the state. And so at times, could we have too many potatoes being grown? An oversupply, which brings the price down, not enough of another product being grown, perhaps missing out on some opportunities for financial profit. So is there a way that the state, some entity, can better coordinate among all the growers and producers in this variable growing season in a way that maximizes everybody's opportunities and potential? As an investor, particularly if, and you're going to hear from some of the investors this morning, who are not from Colorado, if they look at this state and want to invest, it seems to me they'll have better certainty if they sense that there's that kind of coordination and understanding among all the producers and growers. There are some states that are blessed with the kind of weather that allows them to produce all kinds of products almost year-round. We're not one of those states, given all the variability. So that's one observation that I'd like to make. The second is analyzing both for export and import trends in agriculture, and again, to use that macro information to better advise growers and producers here about how to take better advantage of export opportunities, but also opportunities throughout the country. We've looked at a couple of companies that are now looking at, can't go into the details, taking certain food products here in Colorado that have a Colorado name and reputation and making them available in other states. It's almost like when I buy a green chili from Hatch. There's something about Hatch that makes good green chili. Well, Colorado has a number of extraordinary products that are very popular around the country. How best can we maximize that opportunity? So that's the first general theme. The second is identifying gaps in the value chain. And I have a feeling you've already probably talked about this in the last couple of days. But again, as an investor, if someone's coming to Colorado and they notice that there are gaps in the value chain, they're going to have questions about whether they should invest in a certain company because they're not sure of either transportation issues or other kinds of issues, which raises doubt about the viability of a particular company. So looking at gaps in the value chain, in conversations with some of my friends at the state, I learned something that I was not aware of. If you look at the craft brewing industry here in, bless you, here in Colorado, anybody here from the craft brewing industry? There's got to be at least one. Well, congratulations. I mean, it is a booming business, right? This is an incredible business that started here in Colorado and now developing a national reputation. But this is what I learned. There are some gaps in the value chain. So for example, the hops industry, pelletizing operations. There are insufficient pelletizing operations. The need for malting in the craft brewing industry. I was not aware of that gap. The need for dehulling operations to support millet producers. Well, if someone could coordinate all of that and find a way to encourage and incentivize others to fill those gaps, then I, as an investor, am going to have better confidence and greater confidence in knowing that if I invest in this industry, all those gaps are taken care of. And I won't have to worry about those in doing my due diligence. The third point that I want to make, and I think we begin it today perhaps for the first time, is finding a way to bring together traditional financial institutions and innovative financial institutions to come together and find a way to synchronize their investments so that we can have maximum impact for companies that are looking for funding. So you're going to hear today, for example, from people who are very early stage investors. And in our conversation earlier today, we talked about the importance of having perhaps a later stage investor know what is going on with the early stage process so that when that company passes their 9 or 12 month or 1.5 year stage of maturity, there's somebody else ready to step in to take the company to the next level with some more long-term financing. That kind of coordination among traditional and creative and innovative financiers is something I think we need to have more of in the state. And the kind of questions that would be asked in that kind of a conversation are, what would it get to make you more comfortable in making investments in agriculture? What kind of business model would you like to see? What might non-traditional financiers learn from agriculture, which might sway them to, quote, take a chance to check off that diligence question and say, I now have confidence. So that's another conversation we can have, and I think, again, thanks to this panel that we're going to have, we're going to start that conversation. And lastly, look at all the other potential forms of financing. Some of you may not know, but the SBA sponsors an entity called SBICs. SBICs, small business investment companies, invest in very early stage companies either through equity or debt financing, but there is not one SBIC in the state of Colorado. And in talking to the SBA administrator, he said, I'd love for someone to start an SBIC in Colorado. Cathay, maybe you can find someone who can start one. There's a gap in the financing there. Working with the Exim Bank again in terms of understanding the Export Credit Agency, the U.S. mission, to ensure that U.S. companies have access to financing to allow exports. I know there are some conversations there. Can we improve them? Look at all the grants and loans from USDA. Someone made mention earlier of crowdfunding platforms. Look at the number of new crowdfunding platforms that are available. AgFunder, BarnRaiser, Kickstarter. Those didn't exist a few years ago, and there'll probably be more. How can we bring them into this conversation? And then, of course, accelerators and incubators. We're going to have one of our panelists who is in that business, but these are organizations which provide entrepreneurs with the tools that they need to be ready to raise capital from institutional players. Here you have Innosphere, here in Fort Collins, the Unreasonable Institute, Village Capital, Techstars, and there are others. But the question is, how can we bring all of them together to do a better job? Now, there's one state, North Dakota, that apparently has started down this path. North Dakota created the North Dakota Ag Products Utilization Commission. It's a long name, but what does it do? It is to create wealth and jobs through the development of new and expanded uses of North Dakota's agricultural products through a grant program and other kinds of assistance. But that state has decided to try to engage in some of the questions that I've raised here to help the entire agricultural community in that state. Thankfully, here in this state, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but Representative Dave Young and Jenny Arndt apparently are considering legislation which might replicate what is going on in North Dakota and do it here in the state of Colorado, something which is very much needed. So I hope you follow that, and if you know them, talk to them, and hopefully encourage them to move on. Let me close with a brief description of what we're doing now in Denver with the Colorado Impact Fund. Some of you know that I was a managing partner of Vestar Capital Partners, which is a private equity fund headquartered in New York and Denver and Boston. And we do traditional kinds of equity investments in mid-sized companies. However, thankfully, about 10 months ago, we decided to create an affiliate fund, a smaller fund of about $63 million to invest in Colorado companies that are involved in healthcare, education, economic development. What do we mean by that? If we find a company, let's say, in the San Luis Valley that has a 20% unemployment rate, and they're going to create 20 or 30 jobs, that would qualify in terms of our economic development criteria to make an investment there. And also in conservation of natural resources. Those are the 4 areas that we're looking at, and again, we've already made our first investment. So let me end this conversation by saying that there are great opportunities in the state for all of us to work together even more closely than we have in the past. And by doing that, I think we can find a way to match financial sources with innovators, producers, and others, fill in the value chain gaps, and give the kind of certainty and stability that investors need to see in the state of Colorado. And if we can do that, and I'm very confident we can, I think we'll be able to have this session next year and talk about some of the successes. So thank you all very much. Let me now invite our panelists to come up. Please come on up, and as they come up, as they are seated, I will introduce each of them, and then we'll come on up. I'll take the middle chair, I guess. I'm going to start with the most important person, and that is the only woman on the panel. Mary McBride, some of you may know, is president of CoBank. It is a very substantial financial institution in the state of Colorado, and we're very thankful that you took the time to be here today. Mary, thank you very much for being here. We appreciate it. To my far left is Joel Harris, who has come all the way from Washington, or Washington, D.C. He's the director of Mars Ventures, and you can describe it. It's an offshoot of the Mars company, Mars family.
Right. So we're the strategic venture capital arm of Mars Incorporated, the global food company.
And I'm going to have Joel give you a 3-minute description of more of what his fund does. To my left is Tim Croissant.
Yes.
I pronounced that correctly, didn't
Perfect. Great job, Fred.
Thank you. He's the Eaton Market president of the Bank of Colorado. Some of you probably already know him. So, Tim, thank you very much for being here. And to my far right, Thad Simmons from St. Louis. He's the president and CEO emeritus of Novus International. He's the co-founder of the Yield Lab, and he's the board president of the International Food and Agribusiness Management Association. So, Thad, thank you for coming all the way from St. Louis.
Pleasure.
Okay, well, why don't we get started? Maybe you could start with a description of your venture fund and what you're looking at.
Great.
And how might someone in this audience benefit from what you're providing?
Absolutely, glad to do it. So as Fed said, I've come from Washington, but actually this is something of a homecoming for me. I grew up outside of Grand Junction in a very small town called Loma, which is your second exit off I-70 before you hit Utah. So it's great to be back in Colorado, and just a real honor to be on the panel. So as Fed said, I'm at Mars Ventures. We're the strategic venture capital arm of Mars Incorporated. Mars is a family-owned global food company. We have 6 business units: chocolate, pet care, food, drinks, Wrigley, and Symbioscience, which is a life sciences incubator. Most people know us for our well-known chocolate brands like M&M's and Snickers, but we have a much larger food portfolio than that. We started Mars Ventures about 2 months ago, so we're brand new, out looking in the market for investment opportunities, and our investment mandate is focused on human health and wellness, looking at the intersection of agriculture, food, nutrition, and human health. So we would be a very traditional venture capital investor. We're looking at early stage investments, so anything from a seed stage opportunity to a traditional Series A financing, which is generally the first institutional money into a venture, to a Series B and up to a Series C. So we would be very much in the early stage of the venture capital investment.
And Joel, just for the benefit of the audience here, my mic's off, that's all right. What would be your typical range of equity investment, for example?
So we generally think in $3 to $5 million terms for an investment, but we would be willing to go lower for that if it was a compelling opportunity that fit our strategic thesis.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Tim, shall we turn to you? And
Sure.
You're come from a much more substantial, not that you're not insubstantial, but traditional. I've got to be careful what I say up here. This panel could end very quickly.
Yeah. Before we came up, Mary and I were talking. We're probably the least exciting part of this panel.
But very important.
Very important. So
You got the big bucks.
yeah. I'm a native of northern Colorado, grew up on a family farm, and an alumni of Colorado State University with an ag business degree. So I have really haven't taken my roots very far, but this is home for me. I represent Bank of Colorado, which is really the traditional bank funding source. We all know that we live in communities where we, as banks, gather up deposits, and we take those deposits and lend them back to our area businessmen and farmers and ranchers. Bank of Colorado is a $3 billion company with 39 branches across the state of Colorado, with the majority of those in the rural areas. So we're reaching out to the actual farmers, ranchers, producers, and providing them the capital they need to produce and be profitable in their sectors. We're part of a larger owned family banking company, Pinnacle Bank, family-owned agricultural company that has $8 billion of assets and banks in 8 states with 130 branches, and I can proudly say that the majority of those are in agricultural rural areas. So that's area that I represent today.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim. I'm sure you're well known to many people in this audience. And go Rams.
Yes. There you go.
Why don't we start, Mary, I'll come to you last. Thad, talk a little bit about your strategy, and you're an accelerator, but you're also a funder. Describe your efforts there, please.
Okay, well, I'm glad to be here and be able to talk about the Yield Lab. Just before that, I kind of give how I came to this place. I was working for Monsanto and a long time ago, and the business unit I was working with was sold to Mitsui, who was mentioned as being an investor now in the space, and so I was working for Novus International. We're based in St. Louis, about $1.3 billion in sales. We provide nutritional supplements going into the livestock feed all over the world. We have customers in more than 100 countries, and so it was a great job. I was CEO there for 13 years, and the end of March last year, I retired from that position, and I had been been an angel investor in St. Louis for a few years and working with that. And probably many of you have seen the Kauffman Foundation report that came out last April. And I took this to some of my friends in the angel community there in St. Louis and said, why don't we see ag tech companies coming before our group? We're in the center of agriculture here. Why don't we have that? We have the Danforth Plant Science Center. We have Monsanto. We have all these great companies and institutions. Why don't we have more of that? And I said, well, go do something. Go make it happen. And so that's what we did. So working with Cultivation Capital, which is a local VC firm, they had started an accelerator program in financial services the year before, the 630 Fund with Jim McKelvey, one of the founders of Square. And Square was given away yesterday as a prize. So it was good to see they had a little experience in starting an accelerator program. So last year they started two. One was the Yield Lab and the other is Prosper, focused on women entrepreneurs. Now when I say they started, what they do is they provide the backroom support, all that compliance stuff, being a lawyer, I was concerned about making sure all that stuff was going to be done right, and the diligence team. But the financing, we had to go out and raise the financing ourselves as our group. So when we launched last year in September at the Ag Innovation Showcase, all we had was business cards. We had no structure, no company, no money, but we knew we would bring it all together to be able to get that going, and we did. And between September and October, when we had the opening for applicants into our accelerator fund, we had 115 applications from 15 countries. So this thing called the internet actually does really work to get your news out there. So it really works to get, and that tells you there's a huge amount of deal flow. There's a huge amount of people with ideas, and we saw some of it yesterday with those 6 pitches that we saw here. So many ideas from all over the world that are really trying to get that early stage support. So we got our team together, our managing directors, we got our advisory team together, and all this stuff is on our website, so you can see it in more detail. And we were able to invest in 5 companies in January, and 2 of those companies are in biodiesel, 2 of them in big data, and 1 of them is in organic fertilizer. Monsanto Growth Ventures will invest in us this month, allowing us to have big companies take a long time. They should have invested last year, but anyway, so this is going to happen this month. And with that, we'll be able to close on 1 more company for this year's class. And so the way it works then is the companies don't need to move to St. Louis. They just need to come to St. Louis once a month for our programming and be there for 2 or 3 days. And with that, the mentors, who are the managing directors of the Yield Lab, will mentor them all during the course of the month. And it's a 9-month program, and we're still learning. There are many kinds of accelerator programs. You mentioned many of them. And many of them are in the 12-week kind of boot camp kind of an approach. But our focus is on companies where they really have a team in place. They have a prototype probably in place. Several of our companies already have sales. So and they are looking at being able to expand into the US market. So a big data company from Argentina is one of our companies. They're looking to establish an office in St. Louis for the US market. Or we have a company, the organic fertilizer company from Pennsylvania. They're very much focused on athletic fields and big sports teams right now. So for them, it's how do they take their technology and bring it into mainstream agriculture. They're actually at Series B. So that was much farther along than we expected. And so really the $100,000 that we invest in the company didn't make so much difference to them. It was the network access, and that's what's really making a big difference. So each one of these companies is quite different. And so the way that we do our programming is very different for each one as well. We'll be reopening applications in September. Hope we're probably 80% committed on our funds. Will be about a $3.5 million fund, so pretty small. But the intention is next year to be able to invest in 10 to 12 companies and to stay at that kind of a pace going forward, and building up the mentoring and building up the investments to be able to do that. So what's missing, and we've had a lot of conversations, I've had conversations here with a lot of people, what's missing here and missing back in St. Louis is in what happens next. So what is the follow-on funding? Where does it come from? So yes, we have a lot of people from the venture capital world starting to get interested, but they're not here, and there are really not many of them in St. Louis either. So we're going to have to start creating locally much more appetite for venture capital. We're to find other sources of it. We're to find people who are committed into agriculture. And I think there are people here in this community, once they can understand that we can de-risk a lot of this, so they're not going to put their family farm at stake, because we can help in terms of our kind of programs. So what Mars is doing, what we're doing, we can help de-risk. That's our role. But then we need that follow-on funding to come in and help these companies continue to grow.
Thank you very much, Ted. And that's part of the conversation that is starting here perhaps for the first time. How can we find succeeding financiers to take those companies to the next level? And that kind of conversation, I think, is very, very helpful. Mary, you're the president of a bank that has over $100 billion in assets.
Yes.
Don't get nervous.
Okay.
The federal regulators are not here right now.
All right, good to hear it.
But talk about your bank's view and the kind of investments you make.
Sure. First, as Federico mentioned, we've got about $100 billion in assets. We are part of the Farm Credit System. And like Tim mentioned, too, we are a senior debt lender. So we're on the other end of the spectrum from Thad here. We've got about a $65 billion agricultural portfolio, which we lend in all 50 states. And our average customer for that portfolio, 24 billion of that would be in our, what we call our retail sector, lending to farm and grain supply cooperatives all the way up to your very large entities such as Land O'Lakes and Ocean Spray. We also have about a $40 billion portfolio where we lend to farm credit associations who then lend to the farmers and ranchers directly. And that includes 3 of the farm credit associations that are located here in Colorado. Now, I think as important as that agricultural portfolio is, one thing that's very near and dear to our hearts is the vibrancy of rural communities, because we know that agricultural side cannot remain strong without vibrant rural communities. So we also have about a $16 billion portfolio where we lend to rural power, rural communications, rural water, and most recently, rural health care. Now, as I mentioned, we're a senior debt lender, but we have seen the need for the venture areas that Thad was mentioning, and we've invested in 2 venture funds. One is Midwest Growth Partners Fund, which is a fund out of Iowa that's focused on bringing in equity and mezzanine financing into rural communities in the upper Midwest. And then the other one is something that we've done with our Farm Credit Partners, which is a rural business investment corporation that we set up last year that's about a $155 billion fund called Advantage Agricultural Capital. And it's just now getting underway to make those investments. So we're trying to find ways that can take the companies that Thad mentions, provide interim financing so that ultimately they will be the companies that we can finance at the senior debt level at CoBank.
That's extraordinary. So,
We've had conversations with Advantage.
Oh, you have?
Yeah,
Great.
they're in St. Louis.
Yes, they are, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
so Advantage, let's follow up on that. So Advantage has, how much did you say?
Well, they've got other funds, but for the Farm
see.
Credit System, they've got the one fund that we set up, which is a $155 million fund.
155 million,
Which
okay.
they're just starting to make investments in, and it's focused on really, we're hoping it's going to be focused more on the agricultural sector nationwide.
Okay. And so I guess the question is, how can all of us work in a more supportive way with what Mary's doing and what you're doing, so that there's this continuum of financings? Anybody have some thoughts about that?
Well, I think you raised a great point, and it's really thinking about, I guess, the way we envision, so we think about this from the standpoint of innovation in the food and agricultural space, and what there really needs to be is a supportive ecosystem an ecosystem of financiers at the varying stages of investment that are and risk level that are appropriate to the different actors in the financial value chain. And then there's university and research, there's entrepreneurs. So I think a lot of this is how do you, and you know, being in Fort Collins, you have a phenomenal asset here in the research and the science that goes on here to form a foundation of that ecosystem, but there clearly needs to be a number of players involved to really nurture that and help that drive innovation.
Yeah, because you know, one of the things, and Mary, what your thoughts here, you know, some companies come to our fund, and they're very, very early.
Yeah.
And I may not know who to, you know, not pass them on to, but who to recommend.
Yeah.
Look at them. Or perhaps there are some that are far too mature, and you know, our maximum investment is going to be maybe $4 or $5 million. They're looking for 10 or 15 or 20, and unless we partner with somebody else, and we may or may not want to do that, we want to pass them on to someone else. So what are your thoughts about how we coordinate better?
I'd say 15 years ago, we didn't coordinate much at all. Entities came to us that were really early stage, would say, we don't do that, go find someone. Now we're trying to have much better relationships and work with more venture funds, no other parties, and sit down with a company that comes to us, and maybe if it's not far enough along, really tell them, here's what we would need. Here are partners we can work with. Here are ways that we could structure a financing. So there are ways that could be having an additional mezzanine or equity, but there are also other ways that could be done through supply agreements, offtake agreements, other arrangements that can de-risk that entity to make it more acceptable for senior debt. So we're very open to having those kind of discussions. And I think it's a change in mindset. I think it's a change in saying we've got to look at this, just as Joel said, as an ecosystem and not as this is simply our role.
And who's best positioned to bring that kind of coordination? Because normally financial institutions don't necessarily talk to one another. You've got regulators overlooking your operations. Who is that a state function? Is that a nonprofit function? Is it CSU's function? Who can best bring that kind of coordination? Any thoughts, Tim? Or?
I think about it like a network, right? So you have nodes in a network, and there are certain nodes have certain roles, but you want to have a robust network that can, is resilient to different shocks. And so you want multiple players in that network who are talking to each other and saying, as you said, we may not be interested in this, but if you talk to this group or that group. And so in that sense, if the network is strong and it's robust, then it can almost coordinate itself, But I think it takes active venues like this to convene and connect people to really strengthen that network.
Okay. You were going to make a comment.
I think Colorado State would be, as a land-grant university, would be excellent because that's where a lot of the thinking begins, and that's where a lot of research begins. So I think it would make a logical sense that this would be a good starting point for those connecting groups.
Okay, great.
Well, I find that, at least from the St. Louis side of it, everyone that's investing in startup companies is very well connected with each other. Yeah. And there's a lot of sharing. Yeah. So whether it's going to be in information technology, social media, or medical devices, and all the things that the angel investors invest in, we have organizations like BioGenerator, which is a nonprofit. They have free lab space. You want to come in, you're laid off from Pfizer, you got this great idea, you come in there, they help you create your team, and they help you get your research commercialized. And then they're ready then for someone perhaps like me, if they're in the ag tech space, because we can take them on then to the next phase, which is kind of that pre-commercial to commercial phase. So I think but it's, to some degree, I think Joel is right. This is going to be sort of a network that kind of creates itself. There are not very many that are doing what we're doing at Yale Lab, but there'll be more, because there are a lot of accelerator programs. There are just not many right yet on ag tech, but there are some on food tech already in Chicago. So there's one in California called Thrive, which is more focused on the kind of production systems they have there. So it will happen, and I think it's just by getting to know people and knowing where each one of us have our interest and where we can bring value to the other. And at least for now, it's very pre-competitive. It's not like we're trying. The deal flow is more than enough for us all to be able to be satisfied that we're moving along with what we're trying to do.
Absolutely. At the Colorado Impact Fund, I think in 6 months we've seen probably 90 companies, all Colorado companies. Wow. These are not, you're looking at, but extraordinary ideas terrific entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
And we can't do everything, obviously, and some are at different stages, and there are diligence questions that we have for all of our investments, but the need is here, and what I find in this state is the level of creativity is extraordinary, and I think most of us would be a bit surprised. You probably see it a lot,
We do.
Mary, but I was frankly very surprised to see it all. Thoughts on what would it take to make you more comfortable in making you're investing in 2 venture-like funds, and what kinds of worries do they have in making these kinds of investments? What can people out here think about in terms of preparing themselves so they can get some funding?
Well, I think one of the key ones is you've got to have the strong management team in place when you're looking on the venture side there. That's probably one of the first ones, the first stop I would say that the
Number one.
venture companies we've invested in are looking at. The second ones is it a sound idea? Is it sustainable? Is it scalable? All of those areas too. Where is the technology? How much needs to be developed there? But I think really fundamentally you've got to have that strength in a management team and be able to pull together a strong business plan that makes sense. We've had some instances of people come to us and it's really just an idea. You've got to be able to flesh out that idea more than just have an idea.
And you could help do that at your
Absolutely.
location.
We
You'd
could.
help them develop a business plan, think about strategy, what's our niche, how to
Right.
market.
If you have to go to one of those 6 big ag companies, and we know who they are, so how do you get yourself ready, having used to work for one of them? You have to think about how those companies are thinking about the world. And one of my partners was the vice president of strategy in Monsanto, so he knows a little bit about how they think about things. Another of my partners was the vice president for procurement for InBev, Anheuser-Busch. So he knows 1 or 2 things about how they think about, and especially you talk about all the missing pieces in the brewery industry here. Well, if you're managing that for all of InBev globally, like he did the past 3 years, I guess he knows something about that too. So we have a team like that can really help these companies think through what are they missing in terms of that value chain pieces, their supply chain, as well as how they're going to be able to approach these big companies. Not Yield Lab, but I'm invested in a company, and I'm on the board of a company in Kansas City that is in the clean tech space. And they have much the same situation. They have a new product that's a natural surfactant, biodegradable, not one of these nasty chemicals. But the reality is those big chemical companies own that leather tanning market. They're the ones that have the service contracts. They're the ones that have all the reach globally. So a little startup company in Kansas City, how are you going to compete with one of these companies in Turkey or in Germany? So that's what I can do because I have been coming from the chemical industry. I can help them think through how those companies think. And then then the management has to decide which direction they want to go. But I think that's the role that we can bring.
Yeah, and that's extraordinary. One of the things that I say to young entrepreneurs when they come to us or others is, look, there's lots of money out there, believe it or not. There really is. But the question is, where are you going to get more value? If you go to a certain venture fund and they have no knowledge of your industry or your marketing strategy, whatever, they may be able to provide you with money, but they're not going to bring you any value. And so what we do at the Impact Fund, we have a number of individuals who invested in our fund, and they're all experts in their fields. And so we'll have them sit down and listen to the presentation, and they can, of course, advise us in looking at what are the shortcomings in a certain presentation, but also ask supportive questions of the presenters that say, well, have you thought about this? And you haven't quite, crossed that T. And that kind of value is very, very important for people who are looking for funding. Just, there's lots of, quote, dumb money out there, and that's not very helpful to you. You want smart money, people who are actually going to perhaps serve on your board and give you some ideas and someone who has a lot of knowledge. I think that's the kind of financing you're looking for. Other thoughts before we open up questions from the audience, from any of our panelists?
I think Mary hit on 2 important points: the personnel, the management team, the scalability of the idea. I think the other. So for us, we would be thinking about: is this venture something that is a strategic fit with our investment thesis in human health and well-being? And then I think there are these general points that Mary was making. Another one I would throw into that is the product or service or technology differentiated from its competitors? and how so, and is that differentiation scalable or sustainable over time, excuse me. So I think really being able to articulate the entrepreneur how this offering that they have is going to stand out in the competitive space is important. And I think in addition to scale and management, those are big items.
I would add something.
Yes.
What I would add would be if you're looking at a venture partner is very different than what you're looking at in me as a senior debt lender. You can replace me pretty easily because the terms and conditions are really usually set pretty well. But you need to know that that venture partner is going to be there for how long you need them. And if they've got a different view on the horizon or their exit strategy, it can have a huge impact on you. We've had instances where we've been a senior debt lender and venture partners have wanted out early and have created a lot of havoc and problems for companies. So I'd say you've really got to be comfortable with the relationship you're going to have there.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to the point you made, we saw a company the other day and they made a presentation. And before we had the meeting, I just went on the internet and found out how many other companies are doing what they're planning to do. And there were several. And when they came in, I said, well, what about company X and company Y and company? They didn't know about those companies. And that said to me, they didn't do very much diligence in thinking about the business they wanted to form. They didn't have a niche. There were already 5 or 6 companies that had been in that business for 4 or 5 years, and that was an issue. And your point, Mary, is very important too. There has to be agreement on what the exit is. And there are sometimes difficult conversations when the management team has a different view of the exit and the investors have a different view of the exit. You don't want those conflicts in an early stage company. You don't want those kinds of conflicts. There are enough challenges in just trying to make the business successful, and you need complete, as much as you can, agreement between the investors and the board members and the management team. Did you want to add a comment? Okay, why don't is this a good time to open it up for questions? I think there are a couple of people with roving microphones. Gentlemen? Yep. And if you want to introduce yourself, feel free.
Sure. I'm Alan Rudolph, Vice President of Research here. I'm fortunate in my experience to have started companies in the biomedical space where the value tick creation is pretty well set by the FDA in terms of getting into human clinical trials and things like that. Could you talk about, perhaps in some specific examples, where are the value-creating steps in these new companies? I could imagine scale is one of them in terms of getting from a pilot to some scalability. But in the absence of regulatory structure that sometimes set those value-creating marks, what in this space do you look for in terms of the maturation of these companies?
Who would like to start?
I can start with that because it's one of the things we struggle with, and I think it's one of the things that all the angel and VCs are struggling with. It took a while, though, even in medical devices, for people to start understanding where those exits could come, and I think as time goes on in the ag tech space, we'll come to understand those, and we'll come to understand there's not one way that's going to be done. If you're looking at something that's going to be an animal health product, it's going to follow pretty much the same thing. It's an FDA process. It'll have the same kind of milestones that have to be met and the same kind of exits that could be possible as an animal health product. If it's more for crop protection, you'll have an EPA kind of a process, a regulatory process. If you're something in big data, maybe you don't have any regulatory process. Maybe that's not the relevant thing. Maybe it's going to be in terms of how can I reach a certain scale with regard to a number of users and how many users. So I think each one of these will have to set its own kind of structure for investment. And that's what we're trying to do now as we talk to the venture capitalists that come in after us. How are they looking at these different kinds of companies? You know, we cross over from being information technology to being life sciences. So even the cultivation capital that's invested in us is invested in us from the life sciences side, not from but 2 of our companies are data. So it's going to be interesting to see how that goes out, and I don't think it's going to be one way. It's going to be really tailored to each company.
Yes.
My name is Morgan Norelius. I'm an angel investor and own several greenhouses. And one of the things I found in my angel investing is there's a significant lack of sophistication for the people who have inventions or new products. but dealing with people like you guys, you have a lot of financial sophistication. How do you bridge the gap between your knowledge and your business requirements versus the people at the very ground level coming up with new ideas?
Who would like to take that one?
I'll try to answer that one. I think that's where we're talking about it. You have to have a critical team. I mean, you have teams of agronomists, you have teams of financial, you have legal team people that are on your team that can help with the legal matters. It's hard for one person to have all the expertise in all the areas. That's why it's so important to create those teams, and I'm sure that's what all of us are looking for, is what team have you pulled together that has the expertise in all the various areas. You need legal, financial, the production, personnel management, all those items. So that's the team approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, what we've tried to do in some instances really is advise people on the fact you're going to need this type of business plan, you're not going to need this type of legal help, and then we'll give a slate of individuals or companies that they may be able to talk to who could help them out in those areas.
So what we've done in St. Louis is we actually have, on the nonprofit side, groups that do that, and they get discounted or free, quite often free, advice, legal services, accounting services at the very early stage, because those parts of our ecosystem are really trying to support, from an economic development point of view, as well as eventually having clients, that this kind of space is going to happen. So there are organizations, and I think you have some of those here in the sphere. I think they're doing some of the same things, and so I think there are those kinds of organizations around, and we need to support them, and we need to, so that goes back to the local community, making sure that they can make donations into those kinds of organizations, support those organizations, and provide mentoring at that stage as well. So that's where you would come in to help in mentoring companies at that early stage.
And one of the things we need to do is identify all those so that when someone comes to us and it's clear, they don't have a CPA working with them, they don't have a business plan, they certainly don't have audited financial statements. Okay, let's point them to someone who can help them, a nonprofit or an incubator or somebody else who can help them develop that. And what we do in a very gentle way, and people can tell just from the questions that we ask, that they need to go back and do a little more homework, whether it's their marketing plan or their financials or their management team. They may need a CFO or at least someone who's good at a certain aspect of the business that they don't have now. And the very smart entrepreneurs will get that from our questions, and they'll go back and they'll come back 3 or 4 or 5 months later and said, 6 months ago you asked us X, Y, and Z. Well, voila, here we are. And that's what we'd like to see. That's that maturation in the business plan, in the management team, and they'll eventually get funded if they keep at it. Other questions?
Yeah, we got one over here.
Yes, sir, in the back. Yes, ma'am, excuse me.
Hello, Candace Orm, Village Capital. I'm our global recruitment manager. So the last gentleman, you asked a very great question. That was actually my initial question, but I do have another. And just to add to that, something that we've discovered at Village Capital, we've hosted 2 ag-focused accelerator programs since 2013, and mentorship is incredibly pertinent to them, and it's very critical. So I challenge you as agricultural stakeholders is to not just complain about the pain points you suffer from, but volunteer of your time to give to these entrepreneurs and give your feedback about their innovations. Be very involved in the process. Be a part of the solution, even as canned as that sounds. But a question I have, in sourcing hundreds of agriculture companies in the US and globally, something I've come across is a trend. There's more of an overwhelming trend of innovations around ag tech, but what about innovations that are addressing human consumption of agriculture? So looking at companies in our portfolio like UNU, who've developed a plasma light that's used for human vegetation consumption growth, or Fin Gourmet, who's created a premium product from Asian carp that's meant to feed the global community. What are your thoughts on innovations in human consumption agriculture versus those in ag tech?
Well, I can speak from the impact funds perspective. We would be very open to have a conversation with a company like that, because we think that's a, quote, positive impact in a very broad scale. So we don't use the word social impact, we use the word impact. And so it's a very broad kind of definition of impact, because we didn't want to be perceived as a nonprofit, for example. Our investors expect a rate of return on their investment, bottom line. But we want to have a positive impact the community, and the kind of company you described might fit that definition. Now, where are you located? Because I had not heard of, and how many entities like you exist in Colorado?
I personally am based in Louisville, Kentucky. Fourth generation farmer, started my first agribusiness when I was 14. I'm a Kentucky girl, I will never leave. Village Capital, though, most of our team works out of the Impact Hub in Washington, D.C.,
Okay.
and we're actually a team of less than 25.
But still, that's extraordinary, and I didn't know you existed. By the way, good luck for Kentucky, you know.
No, cards. That's my alma mater. And-
Sorry.
Yeah, but we're at Village Capital. We have our 5th anniversary next month in D.C., so it's
Okay.
pretty exciting.
And do you know if there are any other companies like yours here in the state that you know of that?
In Colorado
Yeah.
specifically, more of what I'd heard of is like clean tech, which we just heard of, like clean tech and ag innovation.
Okay.
Of course, heard of Yield Lab's great work. I've looked into a lot more nationally and globally, but not so much directly Colorado, but really excited to be working with folks like Innisphere and Factory, because we do have other sectors like energy and water.
Great. Well, Candace, thank you very much. That was very
You're
helpful. Question over here.
John Winkle, I'm a farm owner interested in some of the tech that you're looking to fund. So since you're all in that space, I guess what I'm wondering is there anything that you would see coming in the door that would just cause you to throw up your hands and run away, whether that be regulatory or, you know, what are the really key critical components in the decision making, whether that be, you know, I don't know, government regulation, whatever it might be, that would be a big red flag for you?
They're all so different. I mean, government regulation, fortunately or unfortunately, is involved in just about every business we look at in either a big way or a small way. Everything from the cooling temperature and the refrigeration process of a food company, because you certainly don't want any food spoilage, and you've got to deal with state regulators, et cetera. But there's always going to be some kind of government regulation of one kind or another, and so that doesn't necessarily scare us. I think getting back to your comments, it's a management team.
Yeah.
For us, if that's the first thing we look at. If the management team comes in and presents and it's not very strong and it's weak, that's when we thank them very much for coming in and making the presentation, but that's the end of the conversation.
Yeah, it's really, I think
To get on first base, from our perspective, it's got to be a solid management team. Then let's talk about the business.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the product.
Yeah.
Let's go down the line. What do you think?
It's exactly that. It's the inverse of what you were saying earlier, Mary. So you're looking for these things. If these things aren't there, then that would be an area of concern.
I agree. I don't think there's anything out there in the ag space that I look at that says that's on the horizon and it's going to scare me to leave. It's not like, you know, you've looked at something where you've got the car versus the buggy.
Yeah.
I don't think we've got that situation going on here. Obviously, you've got it in certain sectors, you may have things like that. But in general, across the board for ag, I think the outlook's great.
You know, one of the areas that I would worry about is the use of water.
Yeah, that's a good point.
If someone comes to us and they're going to need to use excessive water in Colorado, that would be, if not a red flag, it'd be a yellow flag. So those are the kind of things that we'd probably think about. But other than that, I agree. We're fairly open.
I think that the opportunity is so great right now, and the need is so great, that what's really powerful about this space at this time is how you don't have to be a huge company to be successful in this space anymore. You know, just go back 20 years ago, because of all these regulatory constraints that we had, if you weren't of the scale of a Monsanto or of a Dow or one of the DuPont, if you weren't that scale, you couldn't afford the regulatory process of getting anything into this market. It's not true so much anymore, because now we can start these earlier stage companies. We've learned how to do that from the other industries that developed around us, how IT learned how to do that, how this whole angel investing came about in the past 20 years, and people learned how to do that. Now we can apply that across this sector, and it's empowering a lot of new ideas and approaches. And now the big companies like Mars, the big companies like Monsanto, they are now creating these strategic venture funds because they know that internally it's very hard to develop that really kind of transformational technology. Having run a billion-dollar company myself. I know how hard it was. We had a big R&D budget, but most of ours is D. You know, so someone said yesterday, rob and what was it? Duplicate. Rob and duplicate. I love that. Rob and duplicate. So that's really what happens so much. And so I think that really I don't have anything that's kind of holding us back. It's empowering. This new access to information technology that reaches so many people really is allowing a tremendous amount of innovation to happen in agriculture.
Absolutely. There is a clock that is flashing here. Is it time? Do we have time for one more question, or should we end the?
Okay.
Nope. They says we have 2 more.
We're done.
We're done.
Okay, we're done.
Can
All
we
right.
give our panelists a round of applause? Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.